Here we go. Okay, so welcome to the UK Committee on RDA's new RDA webinar. I'm going to introduce Gordon Dunsire now as our first speaker this afternoon. Gordon's well known as a former chair of the RDA Steering Committee. He is currently still a member of the technical working team, but is enjoying the freedom of not being quite so involved with development. So he has time to share with us this afternoon his expertise. So Gordon's going to give us a brief introduction on today's main topic, which is recording methods in RDA. And I will hand over to you, Gordon.
Thank you, Jenny. You should be seeing the...
We can see your screen, and I'll switch off my video now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is a very informal, brief overview of some of the salient points to do with recording methods in the new RDA toolkit. A quick reminder, there are 4 distinct methods for recording the value of an RDA element. They are unstructured description, structured description, identifier, and internationalized resource identifier, or IRI. The terminology of these recording methods was taken from the original toolkit, which at various points made references to creating a structured description or recording an identifier as distinct activities. And in looking at the new at RDA in the light of the IFLA library reference model, RSC decided to generalize this approach and recognize that in fact there were these 4 distinct categories of values, and they would require a different approach. Each of them requires a distinct approach in terms of guidance and instructions, and indeed in data storage and encoding methods. So all 4 of the methods are applicable to most of the elements in the new toolkit. There are, however, some elements for which some of the recording methods are not applicable, and the reasons for this will become apparent later in this short presentation. There is a complete list of elements which are aligned with recording methods available in the RDA registry. So if you're interested in quickly identifying which recording methods are available for which element, that is the correct way to do it. You can manipulate the download spreadsheet. So I'll stress again that these 4 methods were already somewhat explicit, but mostly latent in the original RDA toolkit. And as we looked at the impact of the LRM, and in particular, this relatively new idea of having an entity for the names of things, for nomens, things started to fall into place. And one of the early revelations was that, in fact, the 4 recording methods actually align with categories of nomen, or names of things, or to use the LRM terminology, appellations. So an appellation is just a label that is used to reference an individual thing. It could be a work, in which case it's a title perhaps. It could be the name of a place, it could be the name of a person, etc. So in normal human discourse, we're not computers, so we don't tend to refer to things using incomprehensible strings of numbers. We use familiar labels called names, and latterly in cataloging, structured names or names that have been manipulated in order to become access points. So there is this alignment between recording methods and the 4 kinds of appellation which are categorized within the new toolkit. So the 4 appellation categories, these are subtypes of the appellation relationship element, are name or title, which neatly aligns with an unstructured description. The name or the title content is exactly what you see. It is not an artificially constructed name, and often it's the name or the title which the thing assigns to itself. My name is, my title is. Access points, on the other hand, which are based on names or titles usually, are structured. They are manipulated. They may consist of more than a single component. So if you add a qualifier to the name or the title of something, then that qualifier data is taken from another element. It could be date of birth, for example. Things are a lot more obviously aligned with the remaining 2 types of appellation and recording method. So an identifier or local identifier appellation or name aligns with the identifier recording method, and the IRI identifier, which is a global identifier for the thing in question, aligns with the IRI recording method. So that's just a fairly simplistic alignment there. The 2 interesting ones are unstructured and structured, and the relationship to name and access point. And that has led to a clarification of the instructions in the new toolkit. Names or titles generally are transcribed, whereas access points are generally manipulated through some kind of transformation rule, such as rotate the surname to the beginning and then follow it with the given names, etc. The appellation categories are also tied in with data encoding infrastructures. The first 3 of the categories, name or title, access point, and local identifier, are all strings. This is in a linked data context I'm referring to. They're all strings. And they are all potentially ambiguous. Exactly the same string is theoretically and occasionally happens in practice. Exactly the same string is used as a name and as an access point and as an identifier. They're all strings, and within RDA, we count them as instances of nomen, the entity nomen, which is a name. The IRI, on the other hand, in linked data scenarios is a special kind of identifier, and it isn't just a reference for the thing that it points to. In linked data, it is the thing. There is a direct correlation between an IRI and the instance that it represents, and it's not treated as a string. We've made this distinction in the new toolkit. Only the first 3 appellation categories are actually given as subtypes of the appellation element and are counted as instances of nomens, but IRIs are treated very differently. They are the thing in itself and are not treated as strings, and therefore they're not treated as nomens, but as some special kind of value. So just to give you an example of what this means in practice, my name or title taken from statements of responsibility that involve me is just straightforwardly Gordon Dunsire. Occasionally you will see G. Dunsire or Gordon J. Dunsire. I never ever use Dunsire, Gordon. That's what catalogers do to my name. And that becomes an access point. I have an ORCID identifier, which is a string identifier. It's not the same as the ORCID IRI. And I also, apart from an ORCID IRI, I have a VIAF IRI as well. And it's worth pointing out that 216477077 is actually a local identifier if it's treated as a string. So those are the ways that the 4 categories of recording method align directly with the 4 categories of appellation. There is also, slightly more surprisingly, an alignment with the 4 implementation scenarios. 3 of the scenarios are in the original toolkit. That's D, C, and B, although they were numbered in the original toolkit. We've added the elephant in the room implementation scenario, which is linked open data, to give the 4 all together. And the way that these data scenarios actually work is to link pieces of data about individual instances of things using different methods of primary linking. So with linked open data scenarios, data packages are linked together using IRIs. In a relational database or an object-oriented database implementation, data is linked together using local identifiers. These are things like table numbers and row numbers. In the traditional bib authority data implementation scenario, Mark 21 being a primary example of that, the access points are used to link authorities to the bibliographic description. And in flat file data, basically there's no linking at all, and things are just referred to directly by their names and titles. The linking is implicit rather than explicit, in other words. Okay, so that's a very brief explanation of how the 4 recording methods align with both the appellation categories and the implementation scenarios. And somewhere in all of that, there's a PhD thesis awaiting an eager student to excavate the reasons why these alignments have occurred. I'll just now briefly go through each of the recording methods to explain how they fit in terms of what their content is and how that content is intended to be used in information retrieval systems. And this will feed directly into a discussion which Thurston's going to lead later about very specific aspects of some of these recording methods in a Mark 21 context. So an unstructured description, the content of an unstructured description is generally transcribed, or it can be a note, or it can be, for some elements, an uncontrolled term. So if you're doing, let's think, say material, and the material you want is not in the vocabulary encoding scheme offered by RDA, then you can make up your own term, but you record it as an unstructured description. Because underneath this, the general principle is unstructured descriptions are derived. They're not controlled. The language and the layout of this data is not controlled by the cataloger. It's not mediated. It follows the principle of representation, or in form of a note or an uncontrolled term, instructions to the cataloger about how to record this kind of data. This means that the content of an unstructured description can only realistically be processed by an information retrieval system as a general keyword index. The content is not controlled. The best you can do is keyword index this. A structured description has much more utility. The content are controlled terms or values. These can be access points taken from an instance vocabulary encoding scheme, such as Library of Congress name authority file or geonames or other things like that. They can also be terms taken from a value vocabulary, a set of controlled terms, such as the vocabulary encoding schemes offered by RDA, or which are in general use, such as the ISO 693 codes for languages. They're also, structured descriptors are also used for compound values. That is where the actual value of the element, which is a string, remember, is taken from substrings which come from sub-elements. And those elements are selected and sequenced and assembled into a single string with punctuation by what we call a string encoding scheme. SESs and VESs are two sides of the same coin. A vocabulary encoding scheme will be using a string encoding scheme for its values. Conversely, if the value you want is not available in a vocabulary encoding scheme, you can, with reasonable confidence, add it using the string encoding scheme. This is familiar to older catalogers as updating the authority file. The utility is much better. You immediately get browse indexes from your authority, people, work titles, place names, etc. And you can also keyword index within the kind of entity that you are describing. So you can have a place keyword index or a person keyword index. It gets simpler from here on in. Identifiers, the content are controlled identifiers from local systems. This basically means the identifier cannot be guaranteed to be unique at global level for whatever reason. They're treated as strings, and they are usually taken from a pre-existing authority file or value vocabulary. It's highly unusual for a local cataloger to be in the business of creating local identifiers, although the systems librarian might be in the thick of it in terms of relational database structures, as I mentioned earlier. The utility for identifier recording methods is just browse. You have a list of identifiers which can be browsed. In fact, what is likely to happen is this is not exposed to human end users who needs a list of ISBNs, but it will probably be intensively used by data processes running on the information retrieval system. Finally, the IRI consists only of international resource identifiers, which are usually supplied from an authority file or value vocabulary. Again, you have to be in a special position to be able to mint your own IRIs. It requires a specific infrastructure to do so, and most catalogers are unlikely to be engaged in this. However, if you're an authority-controlled cataloger, this is going to be a major piece of activity in the future. The utility is obviously linked open data applications. So that's my brief overview of recording methods. I hope it sets the scene for the discussions and indeed Thurston's presentation.
Thank you, Gordon. I think it sets the scene very well. I haven't had any specific questions in. I think that gives us a very comprehensive overview, and particularly like this connection between the types of recording methods and, as you say, the type of information that we are used to dealing with.
Yeah.
Not sure.
The surface explanation for that is as reference. Mm-hmm. So effectively, the utility of access points, identifiers, and IRIs is basically identifying something so that you can refer to it. What we have done in cataloging is we regard the cataloging, the metadata description set as being a replacement for the thing that is being described, and therefore we refer to the what used to be called records as having this identifier. But in fact, the identifier is identifying the thing that's being described and not the record that's doing the describing. But that's why this alignment probably exists. Is as human beings, we naturally, we talk about things offhand. See you, Jimmy. We talk about things more formally. Hello, Mr. James. And then we've got machines that we need to carry out other operations, and machines prefer unambiguous strings like identifiers or IRI. So the explanations are simple, but I still think there's a PhD depth worth of why do human beings do this in the first place, to explain some of these underlying patterns. I find it fascinating, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I think it behoves us as cataloguers to be interested in why information falls into these brackets, not just knowing how to deal with it as a cataloguer. Thurston, we will now move to your prepared work to share with us before we discuss things beyond that. You're going to show us your screen, which we can see now. So I will switch off my video and say thank you, Thurston, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about RDA and recent Mark 21 developments in support of RDA. And I'm going to cover the following areas in terms of the presentation. Looking at Mark 21, its relationship to, interestingly, my share screen is not, the slides don't appear to be moving on. Let me just try to address that.
Thurston, you may be sharing the wrong screen. If you unshare and go back.
Right, okay.
But make sure that the power, not the show, but the PowerPoint software is running, and share that, and then invoke the show.
Right. Okay. So can you now see my behind the screens, behind the scenes of that, or are you still seeing my?
We're seeing the first slide.
Okay, just a second then. Right. Right. Okay, so you should now be seeing my other screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have to click it twice.
Yeah, I'm clicking. I'm not getting any response there.
Yeah, I usually have to click that twice in rapid succession to get it.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm just going to go through. Hopefully, everybody.
Try the menu item slideshow and see if that works.
Right. Okay. So from here, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's see what that does.
It doesn't like.
Still no luck. Okay. Try that. Still
I can
no
see
joy.
it says use presenter view. If you unclick that.
Where are you looking?
Right, the right hand
Oh,
end.
okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That might make it cooperate.
Doesn't look like it.
But having unchecked that, you then go back to starting the slideshow from the beginning.
Uncheck first. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, this doesn't seem to be
it really doesn't
cooperating. All right, I'm just gonna go through these in terms of what we can see on the slide note view, and hopefully everybody will be able to see what I can see, and we can actually get through the slides. So in terms of that's interesting. Now my screen 2 is actually transitioning through them. Right, okay. So, yes, this presentation will cover the following areas, looking at Mark 21, its relationship to RDA, and efforts to update Mark 21 in line with the RDA Toolkit structure and redesign project. We'll be looking at the Mark 21 development cycle, Mark 21 administration, the Mark RDA working group, and also wider community activity. So in terms of the Mark 21 development cycle, it basically consists of the submission of discussion papers, proposals, and fast-track changes to the Mark steering group and the Mark advisory committee, and updates are issued twice a year based on the decisions made by those bodies. And once updates have been issued, there is a 60-day embargo period to allow for implementation. In terms of administration, we have the Library of Congress Network Development and Mark Standards Office, which is responsible for the Mark website, maintaining that and organising meetings of the Mark Advisory Committee. We have the Mark Steering Group, which consists of representations from the Library of Congress, British Library, Library and Archives Canada, and German National Library. And we have the BIC Library Metadata Group at the UK level, which consists of representation from the British Library and from university libraries, metadata developers, and various other community stakeholders. So in terms of the Mark RDA working group, this was set up at the end of 2019 in order to consider issues around implementing changes brought in by the 3R project. And a similar group was formed in 2008 to look at Mark changes resulting from the introduction of RDA in its original form. And the current Mark RDA working group's charge is as follows: to evaluate the scope and impact of the extensions to RDA arising from the RDA revision in relation to Mark 21, to identify and prioritise possible changes to Mark 21 in support of compatibility with the RDA extensions, and ensure effective data exchange into the future, and to prepare discussion papers and proposals for the Mark Advisory Committee. In terms of its focus, the Mark RDA working group is looking at the following 4 sets of criteria: new RDA entities, concepts and vocabulary encoding schemes, the choice of format in which to implement change, the granularity and consistency of change, and the feasibility and utility of implementing changes. So to go into those in a little bit of detail, in terms of new RDA entities, we have the RDA entity itself, the gnomon entity, the agent entity, collective agent entity, place and time span entities. In terms of new concepts, we're looking at manifestation statements, representative expressions, diachronic works, and data provenance. And in terms of new vocabulary encoding schemes, we're looking at things like carrier extent unit, the extension plan, RDA recording sources, and RDA type of binding. It's also worth noting that certain aspects of the original RDA were never incorporated into Mark 21. And here we have a list of vocabulary encoding schemes which fit into that category. For example, mode of issuance, aspect ratio designation, illustrative content, sound content, and form of musical notation. So in terms of the choices to be made as regards implementing RDA in Mark 21, there is the choice of format. Should it be authority? Should it be bibliographic? Should it be another? Should it be multiple formats? As regards granularity and consistency, should the changes be implemented at a record level, at a field level? Is there consistency for coding available field by field or format by format? And then in terms of feasibility and utility, what are the possibilities for introducing changes in terms of the coding which is still available within the Mark formats and which hasn't already been used up? To what extent will change be consistent with current record structures that we're familiar with through things like NACO, BibCo, and the provider neutral model? And what is the helpfulness of change in terms of end users such as researchers and programmers, or indeed internally as regards collection management, the utility for inventory for control, workflow efficiency, etc. So in terms of the work done so far, we started considering papers arising from the work of the Mark RDA working group last summer. And in June, July 2020, coding was agreed for manifestation statements being in field 881 of the bibliographic format, the extension plan in field 335 of the bibliographic and authority formats. And those changes were released as part of Mark 21 Update 31 on the 1st of December 2020. An embargo period of 60 days is put in place for any release of Mark to allow the community for implementation of changes, and that expired on the 29th of January this year. Now, I mentioned that the wider community has also been working on changes, not specifically from an RDA perspective, but which do have a bearing on implementing RDA within a Mark context. So in terms of the changes agreed last year in June, July, we have a means now of recording an aspect ratio designation in $345D of the bibliographic format, and illustrative content in $340P of the bibliographic format. Now, it's useful to note in these contexts that it's already possible to record unstructured values for these things in the Mark format, but this new coding allows you to record a structured term from a vocabulary encoding scheme for the purpose. And again, in terms of those changes, they were released as part of Mark 21 Update 31 and are now usable following the expiry of the embargo period. In terms of coding which is pending, the most recent meetings of the MARC Advisory Committee agreed a new field to record mode of issuance in the MARC bibliographic format, field 334. But the type of binding proposal that was brought has been taken away for further development on the basis that while the MARC RDA working group proposed new 340 subfield $L to record a value for that, various other stakeholders within the community felt quite strongly that other community binding terms should be recordable within that subfield in terms of binding terminologies used by the rare books community, by the art cataloguing community, etc. So that is something that will require further development. And we also had a discussion paper around data provenance, which is a very wide-ranging change associated with the 3R project, and has the potential for resulting in changes throughout the MARC formats. But in terms of the discussions that took place, the community as a whole, I think, were keen to limit the disruption caused by any such changes. So that discussion that we had at Midwinter will help in terms of bringing any further papers forward. In terms of wider community activity at Midwinter, we have a new subfield 344 $I for recording sound content in the bibliographic format, and form of musical notation in 348 $C in the bibliographic format. And just to wind up, I wanted to list a few learning points from the process of working on proposals for MARC changes in the context of the MARC RDA working group. First, one of the key messages to get across is that new coding is not mandatory to implementing the new RDA. As we've sought to emphasize on regular occasions, the bar to creating a RDA compliant description is very low in terms of the new RDA, but in terms of the opportunities for recording new elements or elements that we're familiar with in a greater variety of ways, the work of the group has sought to facilitate that. In terms of other considerations, that there's implementation decisions are made on a case-by-case basis in terms of feasibility and utility. We've sought to emphasize that RSC liaison is available to provide us advice and assistance with the implementation of MARC changes to support RDA. Indeed, the wider community engagement officer, Eb Cartus, is part of the MARC RDA working group. We've also noted that feedback from the MARC Advisory Committee may contribute to RDA developments. For example, the new vocabulary encoding scheme for type of binding, that was a relatively recent development in terms of the changes that took place prior to the new toolkit going live. The discussions around that were partly influenced by the previous discussions of the MARC Advisory Committee. And also worth bearing in mind is that RDA will not adapt to MARC 21 record structures if these are found to break its relationship with the LRM. And the provider neutral record model is potentially one area in which that could take place. And that's all I have to say on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Thurston, both for the explanation of how mark development works in normal times, and also in terms of how things are progressing to accommodate some of the new elements of RDA. In terms of the type of binding, is one of the issues the vocabulary that's being used?
Yes, it is. The new subfield coding, which was proposed by the MARC RDA working group, took its definition directly from RDA. And the definition in RDA is very specific and very constrained in terms of being something that is singular in nature and also restricted to the manifestation entity. In terms of the other vocabularies around binding, which are provided by the rare books community, by the art cataloging community, if you look into those, in the first place, the terminology is often plural rather than singular in nature. And in the second place, they often incorporate other elements such as applied material, base material, color content, and a whole host of other things, which would go well beyond the scope of the type of binding definition as set out by RDA. So if the community feels that they want to use this subfield for the same purpose, the definition as proposed has to change. And so something more neutral, using terms such as resource, might be more applicable. And in terms of the impact that has on RDA, it makes it all the more important that the source of the controlled vocabulary is expressed in the same string using subfield $2. And that can be done. And it should also be noted that other existing subfielding within the 3-4x block of MARC fields can already be used to record vocabulary encoding scheme terms from RDA. So it's not a kind of a showstopper, as it were, but as I say, the definition as proposed would need to change because otherwise it would simply not meet the requirement of the other communities.
Thanks, Thurston. I think that unless someone has an immediately pressing question, now might be a good time to have a short comfort break before we come back for a broader panel discussion that we will close out the remainder of the session with. So I will pause the recording and we will reconvene at just before 3 o'clock. Thanks, Thurston.
Okay.
Return to our conversation about the new RDA, and we were looking at implementation within MARC, and we had just had an explanation from Thurston about MARC development and the efforts to get MARC to accommodate more of the aspects of the new RDA, and the type of binding was being looked at as a proposal. We talked about the issues to do with vocabulary and about the best way forward with that. Gordon, you would like to tell us some more about type of binding, so please.
Sure. I think this is an interesting little case study to illustrate some of the issues in implementing RDA and coding RDA, but also some of the detail of recording methods, which is how this all ties up with the topic of today's webinar. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen with the toolkit. So as Thurston said, type of binding is quite narrowly and well defined within the toolkit. It's a method used to bind a published or unpublished manifestation. Now, I can give you a bit of background to this particular element. As Thurston said, it's one of the last elements to be added to RDA during the 3R project. And it came about because of a detailed review of how, in particular, identifiers are typically presented on printed manifestations. So we typically have ISBD in particular. We will get a statement, usually on the title page verso, that says ISBD blah, 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 followed in brackets, paperback or PBK or something. And then there'll be another identifier with a different qualifying term in parenthesis afterwards. Now, all of these technically identify the manifestation in hand, even though they're intended to identify different manifestations. So as Thurston alluded to in the discussion on provider neutral, the LRM very clearly states that two manifestations published by different publishers at different times are indeed quite separate manifestations. A paperback manifestation is different from a hardback manifestation. And in a true implementation of RDA, the paperback and the hardback would be described separately. And I know this is a discussion that goes back at least 40 years. But most national bibliographies now see a need either to describe only hardbacks and ignore paperbacks, or if paperbacks are going to be described, they get separate descriptions because they're part of the publishing audit trail under cultural heritage. So when the impact of recording identifiers like ISBNs was looked into during the 3R project, we realized that there was no place to put the qualifiers, and the qualifiers could not be put on either the identifier recording method for a manifestation. An ISBN is an identifier for the manifestation, but it does not consist of an ISBN followed by the word paperback. So what were we to do with such information? And there have been other discussions, particularly with the rare books community prior to the 3R project, about recording bindings. And it was all put together during the 3R project, and this is what we've come up with. So there is type of binding, which is to be understood to be a method. So when the MARC group, and I'm speaking very personally here, everything I say it reflects only my personal opinion and does not represent the views of anybody else. When typically a new element is discussed, people tend to seize on the title of the element, that is type of binding, and therefore think it's a categorization of bindings. And then people immediately expect to see what Thurston's already mentioned, like some kind of faceted thing that you could use to build up a description of a binding, such as leather on board with gold tooled decoration applied to it. That is not what the intention of this element is. The intention of this element is purely to provide a place where you can put distinguishing qualification data such as paperback, trade, or hardback, etc., but not using those terms because they're uncontrolled. So we thought a type of binding field in the manifestation entity would be useful for this. We can see other uses for it. And that is what has been put into the toolkit. At the same time, we were very careful to let communities know, informally it has to be said, that if you wish to describe a rare book binding, then what you're actually describing is a separate work. And we actually provide two other elements which are to show how a work can be treated as a binding. So it can either be the binding of an item, and in LRM terms, the binding of an item is a modification of the item. It is a rebinding at best. The published binding of an item is recorded at the manifestation level using type of binding. If it's subsequently modified, somebody comes along and scrapes all the gold tooling off or replaces the leather with parchment or something, that is a modification of the item and has absolutely nothing to do with the publication process of the manifestation. That is typically for rare books. Most rare books prior to, I think, about 1650 were published without bindings because it was expected that the purchaser would bind their own stuff, and that would be a modification of the published manifestation. So immediately in this discussion with the MARC community, that there was misdirection going on. And I don't mean to sound negative here. There are perfectly good explanations for all of these things. By people saying, oh, type of binding, therefore it should do this, without reading the definition, which the definition clearly says it's a method. I wouldn't really call leather on boards a method of binding. I agree that in the vernacular it might be a type of binding, but that is not what this element refers to. That's the first point I want to make. Definitions are there for a good reason, and labels like unstructured descriptions, type of binding, are really not to be trusted as official controlled vocabularies. The next point, I'll go through this. The next point is what a typical value vocabulary element in RDA actually says in terms of recording methods, because I think it teases out quite a few of the issues. So all vocabulary encoding scheme elements in RDA accept all 4 recording methods. That's the first point to say. The reason why they all accept an unstructured description, I've already alluded to, is that the term you wish to record for whatever reason isn't in the vocabulary that you normally use. It's not likely to be in the vocabulary, but you think it's going to be helpful to the user. And so in this instance, if the type of binding you want is not in the vocabulary, which is here, and you decide, and we've had all these discussions within the 3R project, that case binding actually means hardback, then you can use hardback instead of case binding. But that is an uncontrolled term, and you would record it as an unstructured description, which would be a powerful indicator to the data processing algorithms not to expect to find this in any kind of lookup situation, for example, because it's not there. The second, the details, by the way, is your note. So if you need to record a note about this particular type of binding, that one of the corners has been cut off. This is a design feature, for example, then you can record it in the note. With a structured description, an RDA element will typically offer a vocabulary encoding scheme. This is the one that we evolved. We looked into seeing whether an existing scheme would suffice, because we prefer not to take on the burden of maintenance. But surprisingly, both myself and Eb Cartus, the community-wide engagement officer, looked at various online encyclopedias and professional ontologies like the Getty Thesaurus, etc., and we couldn't find anything that was exclusively about the method of binding used by publishers. So this made it worthwhile for RSC to take on the burden of vocabulary maintenance, and this is what we have. We offer this. We also say, I think it's worth going through this, that you can look at the full vocabulary, and you'll find that it's got additional information. There is an IRI. So if you wish to record this as an IRI recording method, there is the data that you need. If you wanted to record the type of binding as an identifier, a local identifier, then you can use this notation. The thing to immediately note is that there are several dozen other terms within RDA Toolkit that have the notation 1008, because it's not intended to be global, it's local only to the vocabulary. And then there's additional information such as scope notes, which help to explain the definition. There are also synonyms. So case binding could be, you could use hardcover binding for this. You should be using the controlled term. As I said, if you use the uncontrolled term, then it should be an unstructured description. So I'll just go back to the instructions. There's always an instruction in these elements to use another suitable vocabulary encoding scheme. And part of the discussion in the MARC communities was, can we use then terms from one of these other schemes that we're using? And the short answer to that is only if the other scheme has the same meaning or scope as the element itself. I can go to absurd lengths and say you wouldn't record happy as an element value for type of binding, even though there may be a value vocabulary of emotional states that you could take. Because the vocabulary covers emotional states and the element covers types of binding, it would be quite inappropriate to use just any other vocabulary encoding scheme. So what is meant by this instruction is the word suitable. The vocabulary encoding scheme has to be suitable, and that means it has to suit the semantics of the element. And there was, from what I understand, there was quite a lot of discussion in the MARC communities about this, about why they couldn't use compound terms that they had just made up from the Getty Thesaurus, for example. If, and in all cases, if you use a VES for a structured description, data provenance says that you should record the source of that controlled term, or its notation, or its IRI. And here's the reference back to using an unstructured description if you cannot find the term you want from your chosen vocabulary. The rest is relatively trivial and falls on from that discussion. I understand also that there has been some discussion, and perhaps Thurston can give us a bit more detail about identifiers or notations. So in some of these vocabularies, they may have notations which are to be recorded. The problem with mark encoding, and this is another big issue, is that it's perfectly feasible to encode in a single mark descriptor a notation from one VES, a control term from a separate VES, and indeed an IRI from a third VES. And there's nothing intrinsic in the mark infrastructure that allows you to say all three of these should come from the same VES. And in fact, it may not be desirable to do so. So there has been a lot of discussion in the mark community also about identifiers and notations as a recording method. And in my opinion, a certain amount of lack of understanding that these are local by definition, even if they've got international in their name, like ISBN. ISBNs are not guaranteed to be entirely unique at global level within the ISBN system. They try hard, but they fail. And they're certainly not guaranteed to be unique, say, when cross-referencing an ISBN with a social security number, which identifies something entirely different. So I just wanted to go on a slightly more length, perhaps, than most people would tolerate on a Friday, to say that type of binding actually uncovers quite a few issues. And I'm kind of hoping that Thurston and Alan will chip in now with some personal observations.
Well, while they're gathering their thoughts, I can vouch for the fact that ISBNs are not as international or as unique as they ought to be. I'm noticing particularly with ebooks that presumably for licensing purposes, they are assigning a different ISBN to the American ebook from the UK ebook. So that's not very helpful. I haven't seen any instances lately, but I'm sure it's still happening, whereby particularly smaller publishers think nothing of reusing an ISBN, particularly from one edition to the next, because it replaces the previous one. So why shouldn't I just use the same ISBN because it's the updated content?
Actually, yeah, I was at a meeting this morning talking about ISBNs of all things, and there were some examples of actually agencies issuing the same ISBN for different publications.
Yeah, and ISBNs that have been abandoned can then be redeployed to a new resource. I'm not sure how long an ISBN should be deemed to be fallow for before it gets reused.
Should never be reused.
Should never be reused. We've still got SBNs in our catalogue.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I haven't got any particular reflections on type of binding. You might be relieved to hear, but I thought it might be interesting to talk about a use case that I don't suppose anyone had anticipated for type of recording.
You're quite quiet, Alan.
Oh, I'm still quiet. Sorry, I don't know. I feel that I'm speaking quite loudly. Bear with me a second. I'll put my microphone on. I've got a headset.
Okay. Thurston, do you want to chip in on type of binding?
Yeah, well, just to come back on what Alan, on what Gordon was saying, in terms of the discussions that took place around that on the MARC list and at the meeting itself. A lot of the arguments that we've just gone through and rationales were set out there. We had a straw poll to see what the panelists at the MARC Advisory Community Committee meeting felt about that. And in terms of passing the proposal as written, that was lost by 18 votes to 4. So even though there was, very little feedback from other participants in terms of you know, a justification for including these additional vocabularies, and indeed the use case for doing so. The mood certainly seems to be that that was the preference. So you know, that I think we need to be mindful of that in terms of whatever we bring back. As I say, I don't think it's a showstopper. It's not ideal, but it will mean that the definition as proposed will have to be rewritten to allow for a broader scope for implementation. It's also worth noting that in terms of some of the other binding related elements that Gordon mentioned, it's already possible to record those in a MARC context, although only in an unstructured way. So I imagine that you know, this particular proposal was seen as a great opportunity in certain quarters for being able to facet information for other binding vocabularies in a way that you simply can't do in the 6xx block of the MARC format. But as I say, the devil is, as so often is, in the detail. The one other thing that I wanted to pick up on was the issue of notations, and the Music Library Association brought forward a set of suggested changes to the 348 field to accommodate form of musical notation terms in there, and at the same time a means to record a coded equivalent value. Now, as things stand, unlike many other RDA vocabularies, Library of Congress's website, id.gov, does not include effectively mirror vocabularies, a mirror vocabulary for form of notated music. And so MLA used the numeric portion of the Curie prefix, I think I'm getting that right, for that set of vocabulary terms in order to provide a form of identifier, equivalent to a coded value to use in that context. And that was done with consultation with the RDA Technical Working Group Chair, and so there doesn't seem to be sort of any issues around that, and it may offer a scope for further development along those lines in the future in terms of using the identifier recording method for recording some of these controlled values rather than simply as structured terms.
Thank you, Thurston. Are you back with a headset now, Alan?
Can you hear me now?
Fire away.
Okay. So yeah, so what I was well, in common with probably many other institutions here, the British Library is looking at the vocabularies and terminology that we may have used in the past, or that may have been used in our catalogues in the past, to describe demographic groups or individuals, using terms that might no longer be considered acceptable, indeed might even be considered harmful or offensive. And one of the things that's actually proved to be very helpful is the distinction that librarians have made between recording methods, and that was carried over into MARC, that we can in fact identify with a reasonable degree of precision where the information in the catalogue has been contributed by a curator or cataloguer, and where the information has been taken from the resource. And this is important because we want to continue to reflect the historical record as manifested in the language used in our resources. But we also want to ensure that what the library has said about the resource stands up to scrutiny and is not going to offend contemporary audiences. And so RDA is perpetuating, and in fact, I think creating a much clearer way of thinking about recording information that I think we would certainly be looking at extending not just to our historical library and collections but to all of our metadata, so that we have a clear distinction between what the library says about its collections and what the collections say about themselves. It will make management of this kind of thing much easier in future, and it also gives us a clear ethical argument for things being the way they are. And this is one of the things that's been exercising me over recent months, because the library's made a declaration about being an anti-racist organisation. And so now we're trying to work out what that actually means in practice. And I don't think anyone who wrote RDA expected that it might be beneficial in that respect.
Of course, that's one of the reasons why data provenance needs to be taken more seriously, I think, and actually recorded as such.
Yeah.
And you know, you know this. I'm just saying it for the record. You see this now on television shows. In fact, I was watching Law and Order yesterday, and that's the American crime series. It's about 15 years old. And the episode was concerned with children with learning disabilities, and they put up a verbal warning before the program started to say that it contained outdated medical categorizations. It didn't explain what it meant. You had to watch the thing to realize what they were talking about. And in fact, it was difficult to spot the problem, but there's a small conversation at one point between a clinician and a police officer, where the clinician says, oh, that child has something or other, grade 4, blah, blah. And apparently these terms are no longer allowed. So I mean, I'm seeing this all over the place. It doesn't surprise me that the British Library's having to tackle this, because I think generally speaking, this is a trend. It's why RDA abandoned its vocabulary for gender 4 years ago. We were asked to add transgender to the existing vocabulary of male, female, and not known. Imagine writing not known as the value of somebody's gender. When we looked at transgender, and a seemingly simple request to add a vocabulary term opened a can of worms, and we spent 6 months discussing it before realizing that there were armed camps, and I mean armed camps, in the United States of America, who were insisting on the one hand that there were 24 distinct categories of transition from one gender to another, whereas another clique was saying, no, there's only 15. And yet another one was saying, ooh, it's 250. At which point RSC said, no way are we getting engaged in any of this. And we withdrew the whole vocabulary and said, use your own. However, to get back to Alan's point, if you add data provenance and say which vocabulary you took your term from and when, then if it says, well, this term was chosen in 1920 from the official US medical department's list of mental diseases, as they would have called it at the time, it's perfectly legitimate. that provenance tells the reader in the 21st century that they may find the terms offensive and out of date, but nonetheless, that is what was being used at the time. And then there are other methods we have for linking the past to the future using linked data, literally. So I find all this quite fascinating, the way the terms come in and out of favor, vocabulary control in general. And I think the simple observation that you can't pin language down, so you can't actually control vocabularies to the extent that perhaps catalogers wish we could.
Yes, but with controlled vocabularies, it is at least easier to make global changes as we update our language.
Yeah. I think the point also that Alan made was that if you use the notation or the IRI, then you can, in a sense, change. The other, I haven't said any of this, but the fairly obvious thing is that needs to be said, I think, is this. I think that needs to be said too. Vocabularies are terms in a specific language. They're not always easy to directly translate. In the RSC's always tried very hard to work with translators to make sure the terminology we use is easy to translate, as easy as possible. But we still can't do it exactly. And so we rely on translators, not translating word for word, but translating the semantics, the meaning of the term, rather than its current English label. And again, I think this is really very interesting stuff, and a very, very good reason to switch to implementation scenario A and recording method IRI, which at one fell swoop removes this problem and puts it back in the hands of the people who create authorities rather than catalogers who use authorities, etc.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole idea of having that identifier that's distinct from the labels is inherently powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the current discussion at with Mark and its use of subfield 0 and subfield 1? Because I am quite happy to admit that I still don't quite understand when subfield 1 would apply.
Well, there is an ongoing debate as regards the categorization of a URI between the Program for Cooperative Cataloging in the US and the RSC in terms of whether it should be regarded as solely as a real world object, or whether it can be both categorized as that and an identifier associated with an access point. Gordon may wish to enlarge on that, but that has been the subject of some correspondence between the two bodies over the last year. But as things stand, I believe that the difference of opinion has not been resolved.
No, it's definitely not been resolved. I think there may have been a published document about this. That's this one here. So on the RSC's website, you'll find a somewhat technical document explaining what the RSC's position over this is. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but for anybody who's watching the webinar, if you're interested in this, then you can find quite a lot of information in this paper here. And this paper was submitted to the PCC for consideration. Essentially, if I can try and explain it, the problem is this. This is a compact URI for the label choir book, the concept of choir book. It's, can't remember if we expand it completely or not. I'm not quite sure why that's not, oh yeah, here we go. No, so if you look at this is the prefix. This expands into this first part of the URI, and then you add the bit after the colon to it. So the proper URI of choir book, which I can show to you, is this, which I'll type into the browser, and then 1001. That is the IRI or URI of the term choir book. And my browser is set up to dereference. It's a technical term, dereferencing, because what I entered there was not a URL, but a URI. And that URI actually points to a concept. What you're seeing here is a page about the concept, but is not the concept in itself. Okay. So the URI resolves to an HTML page, which gives you more information about the thing that the URI or IRI represents. This can be done by machine, and instead of seeing this page, the machine sees something that's much more like this, but it's in linked data triples. So it gives you more information about that particular concept of choir book, the definition, the preferred label, the scope notes, the notation, and its status within the vocabulary. And that is where the problem lies. Because PCC, in my opinion, has misinterpreted resource description framework. And what they're saying is that this IRI for choir book actually refers to this piece of documentation about choir book as a concept and not the concept itself. We beg to disagree. I said earlier in my presentation that an IRI isn't an identifier referent for something. In linked data terms, it is the thing. It's used as a direct substitute for the concept of choir book. And the PCC has published good practice guidelines that says all value vocabularies, all of the VESs in RDA, but geonames, the European Union controlled terminologies for statistics and various spheres of activity, all of those are actually documents and not concepts. That's essentially what they're saying, and therefore the identifier, the IRI, is encoded as $0, which means you point to a document, rather than $1, which means you point to the thing in itself. That's the basis of the problem. And the PCC, while it has not disagreed with RSC's point of view, this was their reply to the paper, while they said nothing about the accuracy of the issues raised, it said that they felt that it was not important at this stage to change their advice, and they've left it as it is. So it's not been resolved. And it's going to come back and bite that community badly in 2 or 3 years' time, in my opinion.
Thank you for that explanation. I will definitely go and look up that paper and expand my understanding. I think where I've foundered on this real world versus authority thing is that my starting point was name headings. Mm-hmm. And of course, a URI can't be the real world thing because that's the actual living, breathing person. So understanding it as pointing to the actual concept as opposed to documentation or authority records about that is definitely helpful. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have some time left. What shall we pick up to discuss further? I'm feeling as though there's probably more to say about RDA implementation and plans therein.
Or we can carry on talking about the process of mark development and yes, some of the challenges associated with that.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be of interest to many of us.
Yeah, I mean, if people have questions about implementation, I'm happy to try and answer them, but I don't know where to start, to be honest, at the moment.
I suppose the first question is how much backwards work when we implemented RDA first time around. The British Library, for example, did a lot of work, global changes, adding content types and so on to bibliographic records. Do you foresee doing similar sort of work in terms of adding in things like static plan information and so on?
Yeah, I mean, one part of that is obviously dependent on having the mark elements in place to do so, but we'll certainly be looking at what we can do retrospectively for our own data. We haven't, I mean, when we did the content media and carrier type work, which first in lead actually, it was quite a lengthy project. And we actually knew what the elements were going to be. So we actually had, and I think we started that. We didn't actually start that before implementation, did we? Because it was about 2000. We did that in 2015.
No, I mean, in terms of the initial implementation, as regards any cataloging work that was being done from the implementation onwards, we provided the configuration for the fields necessary to record content, media, and carrier type. But of course, that left all of our legacy data without that information on it. So after implementation, we went through a quite a lengthy process of putting together a script which would use data elements already recorded in legacy mark records as a means of indicating what the appropriate values for content, media, and carrier type would be. And to that end, we populated around 16 million records with values for those elements. But in terms of the other controlled vocabularies in the original toolkit, provided by the original toolkit, for the most part, we didn't seek to apply those. But yeah, obviously, 3R provides a really good opportunity for reviewing that and seeing where we can expand the existing coverage of vocabulary encoding schemes. Jenny, you just mentioned a static plan. Well, as you'll know, that is a value for the extension plan element, and we now have the new field 335 with which to record values for that.
Yeah, so I mean, what we will probably do is very much what we did previously, which is look at what are the things where we I mean, we'll be applying those things as we go forward for new content or new records, but we won't necessarily have that input, that data there immediately that we go live with FDR. We'll have to evaluate how best to provide that data in our legacy records, and also we have to then schedule doing it, which is actually an increasingly difficult issue.
Yeah, the record processing will take quite some time.
Well, there's a tremendous amount of work going on in the library on different aspects of our infrastructure, and actually managing to schedule major data loads where we're affecting millions and millions of records can be quite challenging. And we've just done some major loads to upgrade language elements, which will actually help to identify expressions, I think. And we've done 4 million over the last couple of years, and that each tranche has been about a month's work to actually get the data loaded, because we can only load about 50,000 records. We can only re-index about 50,000 a night. So.
Right.
I remember when we did the load of the content, media, and carrier type values for our legacy data. We got the script in place, but then had to wait until I think it was the Easter weekend in order to actually carry out the implementation. So yes, Alan's right. It is a sort of a significant undertaking for that number of records.
But I mean, again, the other thing where I think we can, where I certainly want us to be able to do some of this work is with regard to the relationship designators, where we don't particularly want to put the new labels into the mark fields because they're quite unwieldy for public consumption. They're not really intended for that purpose. So what we're thinking about, and we've been looking at how we could do it, is putting the URI, or probably the URI, but into the $4 field, probably as a identifier for it. So that when we actually do have a linked data environment in future, that we can use this information, and we actually have the information associated with the appropriate data in our database. That
makes sense.
And we've found that we can do that based on mappings from existing mark field indicators as well.
Yeah, I mean, probably not for every instance, but for the most important things, we have reasonable mapping.
Yeah.
And we will also we haven't done it yet, but we've got a plan to build macros to actually enable people to insert the catalogers to insert this information automatically as they're processing new material. But people are interested, and people who are taking our data have things that they would like to see in our data. Then tell us. I can't guarantee that we'll provide it, but
yeah, but having an awareness of what other people's priorities are is helpful.
Exactly, because otherwise we'll just stick to our own priorities, of which we have many.
Yeah, well, that's it. Bursting with potentials and all the rest of it, but what's practicable is never usually quite as much as you want to do.
That's right. So, I mean, in terms of implementation, we're obviously discussing our implementation internally, and I've previously said that the current deadline, or the current not before date, I guess, is July of next year. And every time I say that date, I think, God Almighty, that's getting closer and closer. And there is a tremendous amount of work remaining to be done in terms of particularly finalising the policy statements and developing the workflow documentation. And then on the basis of that, making training documentation available to the wider community and developing training tools for the wider community as well. So we're still working out the sort of details of our implementation in terms of, and at the moment, I think given the disruption that's been caused to a lot of activity as a result of this unexpected sabbatical we will be having.
Well, it's not been a rest.
No, indeed, it's just been that we haven't been going to work in the usual way. You know, it's actually putting a timescale on exactly when different stages of this implementation are going to happen is quite difficult.
Yeah, because inevitably the distributed working setups mean that it's much harder to plan training, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we've been developing infrastructure that allows us to do a lot of those things remotely now, which we didn't really have previously. So we're in a better position, but still but that was work that had to be done in order to.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, when we started this, we didn't have, most of our catalogists couldn't access any of our metadata from home, so it was a bit of a problem. We may have slightly drifted off RDA, but
well, no, I think implementation always includes practicalities. We can't ignore that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear from others around the virtual table about their own implementation plans. I would have thought if or
yes,
concerns,
anybody who wants to jump in.
People have got burning questions about, you know, how do we do this?
I think everybody's being fairly shy and quite happy just to listen to others at this point on a Friday afternoon. Has anybody got anything else they want to share or get out before I start wrapping up?
I just thought it might be worth saying a little bit more about the experience of proposing changes in MARC to support RDA. I included a slide at the end of the presentation in terms of learning points. But the thing that it's really brought home to me is that in terms of the community at large, at the forefront of its mind is, I think, a desire to limit, if at all possible, the disruption that may be associated with making changes to MARC in support of RDA. I mentioned data provenance and the potential that could have for, you know, introducing significant and wide-ranging changes across the formats in order to accommodate it. But in terms of the discussions that took place at midwinter, the community seemed very much in favour of limiting the scope of changes which might support that to a single existing field, which then might be used to link to other fields, rather than looking at something that more ambitious, such as introducing new completely new subfield characters to the formats, or a new format or new formats to cover data provenance because of the concerns about disruption that might involve. And another concern has been that in terms of the expanded RDA element set, recording this expanded set of elements would potentially involve a significant amount of more work on the part of the community. And in terms of the message that the group has tried to put across repeatedly, is that, you know, that these elements are not mandatory in terms of applying the new RDA, and that, again, the bar to implementation is set very low now. But those are kind of concerns that have surfaced repeatedly.
Yeah, it has historically always been an issue that if you propose to do something new in Mark, lots of hands go up in horror because they think that that means that their cataloguers are going to take more time because they've got this new place to put data, but they don't have to implement it.
Absolutely not. And certainly from the perspective of controlled vocabularies, for example, there are mitigating processes such as the introduction of macros, those kind of things, record templates that mean that those values can be pre-populated in a particular record before you even start data entry. So, you know, again, we've sought to sort of emphasize the benefits of those kind of configurations in order to facilitate implementation.
Great. Okay, well, it's 5:02. Nobody's sent me any questions recently on the chat, so I think it's probably time to say thank you very much indeed to our three panelists, Gordon, Alan and Thurston. Your input over these three sessions has been invaluable. This recording will be made available once I get time to upload it to YouTube. I'll send the link out in email to all registrants so that you'll know when it's there. And on the basis that I have willing panelists, and inevitably there will be more questions and more to discuss about RDA, our hope is that we will do this sort of discussion and short presentation format of webinar again in a few months' time when we have another round of questions and developments to discuss. Anybody who has any requests or thoughts on what would be most useful to them for us to talk about, please get in touch. Last words from anybody?
Thank you, Jenny, for hosting these sessions and setting everything up and controlling the hordes of attendees.
Well, I don't think I've made any massive blunders, so
It's all gone very smoothly, Jenny.
Yeah,
It has.
thanks.
well, thanks to the Metadata and Discovery group for the use of their Zoom account. That has been very helpful. Great, well, thanks all, and thanks to all those who've attended also. It's been a very positive set of webinars. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.